Our next speaker is Nathan Hendren, a professor of economics at MIT and a founder and co-director of Policy Impacts and Opportunity Insights. His research focuses on economic mobility and economic opportunity for those with different backgrounds and many other related issues. Nathan, over to you.
All right, thanks.
5 minutes.
All right, so this is credit access in the United States. It's joint with Trevor Bakker, Stefanie DeLuca, Eric English, Jamie Fogel, and Dan Herbst. And the motivation for this work is that there's a lot about our background, things like our race, how much money our parents make, where we grew up, that affect our outcomes in adulthood. And access to affordable credit is one of the oldest hypothesized kind of pathways that we have, hypothesized in economics anyway, for overcoming your starting circumstances and achieving some notion of economic opportunity. And so that then raises the question of how does your background, the things you don't choose in life, affect your access to affordable credit and why? And so there's been limited work on this, primarily because of a data limitation. There's not a lot of data sets that link kind of the credit and access to credit aspect of your lives to other measures of things like your background, your race, how much money you make, and things of that variety. There's some exceptions. There's some great work about 20 years ago from folks at the Federal Reserve Board that linked up some SSA data. There's some work with the LEHD data that's been analyzed, but really nothing at the population level and nothing at scale that's allowed us to dive down and really get at the mechanisms here. And so what we did in this work is we constructed linked credit bureau and census and tax data for about 25 million individuals. And we have two samples. The first sample we have is a population sample. It's a 1% sample of everybody in the United States with a social security number. The second sample is what we'll call an intergenerational sample. It's a full sample of everybody born between 1978 and 1985. It's a set of people that I've studied a lot with Raj Chetty, studying intergenerational income mobility. So we can link these people up to their parents and look at their parents' income. Also, for a 10% sample of those parents, we're also going to have their credit information as well. Now, the census and tax data that we have gives us measures of race, income, education, place, like where you live. The credit bureau data that we're going to merge in provides what they call a person-level attributes file that's pulled every 4 years from June 2004 up through 2020. Every poll gives you about a 7-year look back into people's financial lives. You get things like the balances, delinquencies, bankruptcies, number of trade lines that they have, all broken out by the type of credit that they have. Things like mortgages, credit cards, auto loans, student loans, etc. Now, we also have a credit score, or which we'll use as a measure of credit access. The score we have is the Vantage 4.0 score, for those of you that know credit scores. You can think of this as like a FICO. It's a slightly different score, but basically this maps information in the credit file into a prediction of kind of your credit worthiness, so to speak. Okay. So with this data, I want to now kind of talk a little bit about access to credit across different groups. The first thing I want to look at is just what fraction of people actually have a credit file in the United States, and how does that vary by age. So on the horizontal axis here, we have age. On the vertical axis, we have the fraction of people that have a credit file. And then I've broken this out by different race and ethnicity group here. And what you can see is by about age 25, 30, over 90% by age 25, over 95% of people by age 30 have a credit file in the United States. And that doesn't vary all that much across racial groups. American Indians have a slightly lower rate of having a credit file relative to other groups, but broadly high rates of credit files. What does differ pretty tremendously is the scores that people have assigned on their files. So this is showing you one example of this by looking at the average credit scores by race. The average Black American in the United States has a credit score of 621. American Indians at 641, Hispanic 670, whites have a 719, and the average Asian individual has a 745. So about a 100-point gap between Black and white individuals on average. For those of you that don't know credit scores in detail, how can you think about this? The median Black borrower is classified as a subprime borrower, so it would be basically getting the lowest, the worst terms if you were trying to get a mortgage. The median white borrower is 2 levels up, classified as a prime borrower. So large differences in terms of how that translates into access to credit. We can also look at how this varies across the life cycle. So you can see these emerge very early on by age 20, really as soon as you show up in the credit file, these gaps are really emerging. And then they persist throughout the entirety of the life cycle. So if you look at the black-white gap, it's about 95 points at age 25, and it's still 92 points or so up at age 60. Okay, so those are differences by race. We can also look at other dimensions of one's background, focus on parental income here for a second. We'll switch to the intergenerational sample. Who is that? Those are the people we're going to link up to their parents. So Those people born in 1978 to 1985 are 35 to 42 years old here in 2020 when we see them. So we're going to take those people, link them up to their parents, and look at credit scores as a function of your parents' income. So we can plot the quintiles of parents in the national income distribution on the horizontal axis, and then the average credit scores of people. You can see it goes from about 630 at the bottom up to about 740 up at the top. So differences by parental income that are about the same order of magnitude of what you see by race. We can now look at the intersection of race and parental income. So to do that, let's put parent income in the national income distribution on the horizontal axis, plot average credit scores on the vertical axis, and here I'm doing that for white individuals, and you can see it goes up by about 100 points as you go from the bottom to the top of the parental income distribution. You see it go up by almost 100 points for black individuals as well, but at any level of the parental income distribution, there's about a 70-point gap between black and white individuals in their credit scores. Hispanic and American Indians fall in between black and white individuals, and Asian individuals have higher credit scores conditional on parental income across the parental income distribution, and actually have a fairly unique pattern where as you go to the bottom regions of the parental income distribution, you don't actually see as much of a tailing off. Turns out that fact is largely, in a statistical sense, driven by immigration. When you restrict to people with native-born mothers, Asian and white individuals look reasonably similar. Okay. So that's by race, by parent income. We can now kind of intersect the third dimension of heterogeneity that I want to talk about, which is your hometown, where you grow up. And so to do this, I just want to fix a particular race and parental income group. So let's take white individuals, and let's say the 25th percentile of the parental income distribution. On average, that group has a 660 credit score, if you averaged across the entirety of the US. I now want to ask, how does that 660 vary based on where you grew up in the United States? So here's a map of that same statistic produced now for every county in the United States. And what you see is that there's higher credit scores for people who grew up in the Midwest and in the West and portions of the Northeast, lower credit scores for people who grew up in Appalachia and regions of the South. Right? Of the 100 largest counties in the US, low-income white kids who grew up in Brooklyn, New York have the highest credit scores with a 719. In contrast to Indianapolis, it has the lowest credit scores at about 629. Now, there's one more fact I want to leave you with on credit scores before I try to unpack a little bit of the mechanisms here, and that's this enormous persistence that we observe in credit scores across the life cycle. So what I'm doing on this graph here is taking that intergenerational sample and looking at people's credit scores in their late 20s, which here is measured in the 2008 credit file that we have, and binning people into quintiles, basically just based on that score in 2008, and then holding the sample fixed and just looking forward at what happens to their credit scores going forward. And what you see is just enormous persistence. So for those of you familiar with intergenerational income mobility statistics, this is not the pattern that you would see when looking at income. There'd be much more mean reversion and you'd see more convergence. But here what you're seeing is that a 134-point gap here between the second and fourth quintiles remains about a 122-point gap 12 years later. Okay. So these are these gaps that we see by race, by parent income, by where you grew up in terms of credit scores. We broadly want to interpret this as measures of differences in credit access that people experience. In the paper, we provide several pieces of evidence consistent with this interpretation. So people or groups with lower credit scores tend to have lower balances on their credit reports, despite more formal credit inquiries. So we see how often you're trying to get access to credit. They also use a higher share of their credit limits that they have, so they have higher credit card utilizations. They also use have higher balances on student loans relative to other forms of debt. So for those of you that know student loans, they're not underwritten by credit scores. They're backed by the government, so it's sort of credit access restricted in the private market. Looks like it's increasing use of government loans. On surveys, these groups report lower ability to get money to cover an unexpected need, and they're more likely to rely on alternative financial services like payday loans. And so broadly, we're concluding that these groups that we see here with lower credit scores are facing greater credit constraints in the market. And so now we want to turn to a question of why. What's underlying these differences that we observe? So the most natural reason that a lender would not want to give somebody credit is that they're afraid they're not going to be repaid. And in principle, that's basically what the credit score is trying to help with. Credit scores are trying to predict future delinquency, namely the incidence of a future 90-day delinquency, with the idea that that prediction is perhaps helpful for measuring a broader notion of credit worthiness for another marginal dollar of loans that you might be provided. Now, the algorithm, the credit scoring algorithm, does not depend on race, on your income, your parents' income, where you live. That does not go into the credit scoring algorithm. But there's obviously a growing recognition that seemingly neutral algorithms can embed unwarranted disparities or notions of algorithmic bias. And so what we're going to do is try to take some of those canonical notions of algorithmic bias and definitions of algorithmic bias and assess the extent to which the credit score inherits some of those properties. Now we're going to walk through two different measures of algorithmic bias of the credit score. I just want to give a caveat here at the outset that if we think about bias in lending markets, that is potentially different from bias in the credit score. If you think of a loan officer that is making a decision of whether or not to give you credit, they might pull your credit, look at the credit score. They might also ask a bunch of other things or make a bunch of other assessments, even based on how you look or how much what kind of car you drive. Who knows what they're including? That other information could also introduce bias that is not necessarily inherent in the credit score, but inherent in the process of lending. And I'm not going to speak to that. So I just want to be clear about what we're actually going to talk about. We're going to focus on bias in the credit scoring algorithm itself. Okay. And so I'd say we're going to focus on two different measures of algorithmic bias. What are those measures? So the first is kind of going back to Bakker, thinking of a notion of calibration bias. So applied to this setting, how does that work? Well, I want to ask, conditional on your credit score, do different groups have different rates of experiencing a subsequent 90-day delinquency? So I'm going to implement that in the data here. How do I going to do that? You can take the credit score that we have in a pre-period. So let's take your 2016 credit score, plot that along the horizontal axis, and then plot the fraction of people that have a subsequent 90-day delinquency in the subsequent 4 years that we observe in the data. And so you can see here the algorithm is doing its job. People with higher credit scores have lower rates of future 90-day delinquencies, right? And I'm showing you that here for white individuals. Now we want to say, how does this vary across different groups? So we can plot black individuals. And what you see is at any level of the credit score, black individuals are more likely to experience a subsequent 90-day delinquency. So for example, at a median credit score of 660, there's a 14 percentage point gap or a 33% higher rate of future delinquency. Asian individuals actually have lower rates of future delinquency, and Hispanic individuals fall in between white and black individuals. So this is all measured in that intergenerational sample in 2020. So these people are about 35, 40 years old. We can see how this varies now across the age distribution. You might imagine that the credit score kind of might learn about you over time as it gets more and more information. And so I want to introduce a summary statistic of calibration bias here. So what am I going to want you to think about? I want you to think about the average difference between these two lines. Okay, for black relative to white, that difference is about 0.1. So on average, black individuals are about 10 percentage points more likely to fall delinquent. And now I'm going to show you how that varies by age. All right. So we show you that 0.1 here separately by age. You can see those coefficients there. You can introduce Hispanic and Asian individuals. So there's a smaller gap for Hispanic individuals. Asian individuals are less likely to fall delinquent. Right? Now we're going to repeat this for all ages. And you can fill in the graph here. And what you see is at very young ages, there's more calibration bias in the credit score, kind of consistent with this idea that it doesn't know as much about you, so that there's more residual predictive information contained in your racial background. And then it falls over time up to about age 30 and remains stable. Is there a question?
Yeah, I was wondering, so doesn't the Equal Credit Opportunity Act basically not allow them to use those?
Yeah, that's what I was saying before. Race is not factored into the credit score.
And we're just wondering about, I'm sorry.
Yeah, holding the questions to the end. Okay.
I apologize.
Okay.
Unless
You keep going?
Yeah, I'm going to keep going.
Okay, I'll keep going. But I'm looking forward to the question. Yeah, so just to be clear, race is not included in the score itself. And so this is all basically, we'll leave that. Okay, so consistent with the credit score not capturing everything at the outset, there's sort of more residual information that's contained in race leading to this calibration bias pattern here. Okay. So, why do we see this pattern? What is it actually trying to target? I want to just now kind of flip and say, okay, let's actually just look at the underlying delinquency rates that are being experienced by people of different races across the age distribution. So now I'm going to plot this for different racial groups, and what you can see is for black individuals, by age 30, over 70% of black individuals have a 90-plus day delinquency on their credit report. That's twice as many as white individuals and 3 times as many as Asian individuals. Hispanic individuals fall in between white and black individuals. So this is sort of the target of the algorithm, right? It's trying to predict these large, well, it's not necessarily trying to just predict these disparities, it's trying to predict delinquency rates, which vary significantly across these different groups. And what we're seeing is that it's picking up some of those gaps. I showed you those large differences in credit scores, but it's not fully picking up these differences in repayment rates across racial groups. All right? So from a calibration perspective, credit score gaps are understating the differences in the underlying propensities to fall delinquent. Right? And so in that sense, they're biased against more advantaged groups, if you will. However, that's not the only way we can think about bias in algorithms. The other more common definition in the algorithmic fairness and computer science literature is what you might call balance. So how does balance work? It sort of flips the question around on its head, and it says, okay, let's try to equalize error rates of an algorithm across different groups. So how does that apply here? Let's imagine restricting to the set of people who do not experience a future 90-day delinquency in the subsequent periods after we measure the score, and then ask whether or not people of different backgrounds receive different scores ex ante. And so we can implement that in the regression format here as well, and you see that conditional on not experiencing a 90-day delinquency, black individuals experience much lower credit scores ex ante, right? About a 70-point difference relative to white individuals. Hispanics experience about a 40-point gap. Asians, depending on which age you look at, have bias going in either direction. All right. So this is a very kind of coarse measure of balance bias. In the paper, we do a much stricter test of balance bias, which is the following. We observe about 27 years of repayment history in the data from about 1993 up to 2020. And we can restrict to people who never have any even 30-day late payment. It's a sort of a pristine credit history. And what we show is if you take like a midpoint of that time series and look at the difference in credit scores between, say, white and black individuals, there's still about a 10 to 15 point gap in their credit scores. So there's still some residual balance bias even on these kind of pristine credit reports, so to speak. So from a calibration perspective, they're biased against advantaged groups. From a balance perspective, they're biased against disadvantaged groups. So this, we also see the same pattern when you look at parental income and hometown, basically the same pattern of opposing results when you think about a calibration perspective versus a balance perspective seems to be kind of the lesson from the analysis. Now, it turns out this shouldn't be that surprising, so Sendel could have predicted this, I think. So there's a result that is out there that when there's group-level differences in repayment, so those large differences in repayment rates that I showed you, you can't have an algorithm that is both simultaneously calibrated and balanced. You're going to have some bias on one of these two different dimensions. So fundamentally, the real underlying driver of these kind of differences is the group level differences in repayment rates that I was showing you before. And so then in the last moment of time here that I have, I want to turn to the determinants of repayment and try to understand what can we learn about what is driving those differences. Okay. So most natural explanation, you might imagine, driving differences in repayment is differences in resources or income or wealth, right? We're particularly well suited in the tax data to evaluate some of that. We can link you up to kind of your universe of tax returns over a very long period of time, and I'm going to show you also some evidence from some survey data on wealth. So to do this, I'm just going to imagine taking these differences by race and by parent income, and then adding in controls for income or controls for wealth. So let me just show you the baseline here. I'm going to regress delinquency outcomes. So do you have a 90-day late payment on dummies for your racial group plus an interaction with your parent income, and then we're going to just show the raw differences here in the bars, and now I'm going to start throwing controls into that regression. Okay, so the raw difference there is about a 27-point difference in the likelihood of having that 90-day delinquency for black versus white individuals. We can now control for a pre-period income. So this is income at the same time we measure the credit score. That does basically nothing to these gaps. We can control for a full vector of incomes and start to throw the kitchen sink at this. So income from 2004 all the way up to 2020, separate vectors, interactions, etc. We can start to control for measures of savings. So we see your IRA savings contributions in the tax data. We have administrative data on home equity that we get from a source that I can talk about. We can also restrict to the subsample of about 8,000 of our people fill out the survey of income and program participation that has a detailed wealth survey. We can control for a vector of those characteristics. We can restrict to people that have stable jobs, so people that have very stable income growth over a long period of time, and we can throw in employer fixed effects. Basically, you can start to throw the kitchen sink at this, and you can explain the Asian white gap and a little bit of the parent income gap, but you're not touching the majority of the gaps that we're observing. We also aren't able to explain the gaps across geography. So the left is showing you repayment rates by county, and on the right, we're first residualizing repayment conditional on income and then plotting the residuals. And so you can just see that it's really not being soaked up by income patterns in the data. So if it's not income, what is it? Well, I want to argue to you that you're already kind of staring at one source of the potential channel. And what is that? There's a lot of variation here based on where kids grew up. And so one hypothesis is that there's some factors in childhood that might be influencing the way in which you're engaging with your financial lives later in your life. So to try to illustrate this, I want to use this variation in place as a bit of a laboratory to try to explore that hypothesis. And so concretely, I want to kind of put an experiment in your mind, which is the following. Let's imagine that you randomly grew up in a place like, say, Minneapolis, where 64% of people do not have a 90-plus day delinquency on their credit report. That's where I grew up. Relative to a place like Tampa, Florida, which is where my co-author Dan grew up, that has a 40% repayment, non-repayment rate. Repayment rate. I want to ask, would you, having had a childhood in Tampa versus Minneapolis, have different repayment rates in adulthood? So now, obviously, I don't have random assignment to where people grow up, but we're going to use exposure to different places during childhood using a design similar to what I've used in earlier work with Raj. So conceptually, what do I want you to imagine? Let's take people who move to these different places, to Minneapolis versus Tampa, at different ages of childhood. And what you see is if you move prior to if your parents move prior to when you're born, you, for the most part, pick up the characteristics of that map to which you go. Right? You kind of look like the people in the place to which you go. If your parents move after you're born, all the way up to age 23, you sort of pick up less and less and less of that difference, and then everything kind of levels off after about age 23, okay? And so what I want to argue to you is not where people live is random, not when they move is random, but that the interaction is reflecting the causal effect of childhood inputs from exposure to these different places. So what's one alternative hypothesis here that you might worry about with a design like this? You might worry that there's dynamic sorting, that perhaps good parents, quote unquote, are going to good places differentially when their kids are young, and that they're also providing other inputs that are teaching them how to maybe engage with their credit, et cetera. So in the paper, we do a battery of tests on this. The easiest one to do in my 2 minutes remaining is to introduce family fixed effects and identify off of age gaps within siblings. And you can see the patterns are quite similar. Okay. We also in the paper show, so this is arguing that basically about 60% of the variation across place is reflecting the causal effects of childhood exposure on your future repayment behaviors. We also show in the paper that we get a race-specific convergence. What do I mean by that? The race gap that I was talking about at the beginning also varies across place. And if you take a black and a white child and you imagine they randomly grow up in a place that has a smaller race gap, you will see a smaller race gap in adulthood as well. And so in that sense, we can extrapolate a little bit, at least, beyond just the place variation to some of these other differences to think that some of those are driven in part by childhood influences. And so if it's childhood influences, why might childhood influences cause differences in repayment? We talk about a bunch of different pathways in the paper and have a suggestive channel for social capital. So I'll give you the pitch on that real quick. So these are 4 maps from 3 different distinct data sets. The upper right is upward income mobility. This is the odds you sort of reach the higher levels of the income distribution. The upper left is credit bureau data on repayment. Now those are highly correlated. But I've hopefully already convinced you that it's not income itself that's driving that pattern. Another way to see that is to residualize it. You can do more formal mediation analysis and get the same conclusion. And so it suggests that there's a common latent factor that is both providing inputs that increase upward income mobility and repayment conditional on income. And that you inherit this in proportion to how long you spend growing up in a place. What might that factor be? Well, the strongest correlate we have of these maps actually comes from a third data set in Facebook data, which is the extent of cross-class friendships. The extent to which folks from low-income backgrounds have greater access to folks from higher-income backgrounds. Now, if it's childhood inputs that is driving all of these patterns, showed you this place-level variation, you might also expect that there's a strong role of the family. Who else is providing childhood inputs but perhaps your parents? And so I'll leave you with the following. We can regress the incidence of a 90-day delinquency on your income, your parents' income, your wealth, your parents' wealth, and then throw in your parents' credit score. And what you see is if you go in the upper right there, from the bottom to the top of the parent credit score distribution, that corresponds to a 44 percentage point difference in the incidence of having a 90-day delinquency when you're an adult. And so just enormous predictive content that's being transmitted across generations, even conditional on what we can measure through the budget constraints, so to speak. Okay, so that's the paper. Documented differences by credit scores, by race, class, and hometown. Argue that there's some evidence of algorithmic bias in these scores, but the underlying differences are really driven by differences in repayment. It's not so much patterns of income that are driving these differences, but factors that seem to be accumulated during childhood and manifest themselves later in life. And so then, if you want to speculate, I think this really can speak a little bit to the persistence and the troubling persistence that we observe in the racial wealth gaps across generations. All right. Thanks. Does Tobias get the first question?
Yeah, absolutely. I should have updated from the lack of questions.
Just take my
So one question I had was just about
the use of the word bias in a context where the regulator basically forbids to use certain attributes to be used in the algorithm. And then the other comment is more sort of from an IO angle. It seems like a lot of the financial product innovation is happening to escape the credit score, which is sort of interesting. Like this company Klarna that just went, was public, is basically trying to give you, ways to get around the credit score.
Yeah, both great questions. So, I think that, because the algorithm doesn't include race, that's sort of exactly these tests are, for that purpose. It's thinking about hypothetically, if they could, what you see is that the gaps in the scores would be larger, and that's just another way of saying there's calibration bias. So I think that's how you should think about it. More information. So we show in the paper, one of the things, you can actually remove some of the gaps if you condition on access to or use of alternative financial services. So I think there's enormous predictive content in a lot of these kind of more modern sets of data that are being used to do this type of prediction. I think my only concern is that if anything, it's going to push to further amplify. Like right now, it looks like the scoring algorithms are generating, if only the score is used in lending, it's generating a bit of redistribution that we would lose.
Okay, Donald.
Hey, great stuff, Nathan. Two questions. I guess in your past work, you've shown very convincingly that these exposures matter for all sorts of permanent income type things.
Yeah.
Now you want us to interpret them somewhat differently, and I'm not sure whether I am completely convinced that you can do it, in the sense that your first set of papers were quite convincing. It's just general human capital, permanent income. I don't need to think about financial literacy or a true effect on credit score independent of permanent income. Now you throw in income, but the income that you throw in is just a noisy measure of permanent income or the underlying earning capacity. So I'm not sure how you would, with this design, distinguish a true financial literacy learning from more general human capital acquisition in Tampa versus Minnesota. So that then brings me to my second question, which is, I think the really interesting question, which is probably your next paper, is what's the relationship between credit score and income causally? So if the subtext of my question is that credit score here could be just a proxy for permanent income, and the way you would break that if you found an experiment in which your permanent income remains the same, but your credit score is manipulated, and then I can look at the effect of that on your future income trajectory. And I bet you may not have that data yet, but I bet there are a lot of them, because two identical people, they have somewhat different differences, small differences, and one has a bad event and discontinuity. Their credit score, Ashish's credit score, is much worse than mine, even though we're identical. So that would then enable us to estimate the effect of credit scores on future wealth or income profiles, etc., which would really be rounding up this sort of agenda you have in some sense.
No, that's great. So I'll take the second. It's easier. I think it would be interesting to study the causal effect of the score. What exactly the counterfactual experiment is that you have in mind. I think, there's like 1,000 different underlying things that you could imagine generating that variation, and maybe 1,000 papers. The first question, I actually think I hope I can convince you that we're good to go here. we can identify the effect of place on the repayment outcomes and use this exposure variation to show, when you move to Minneapolis 1 year earlier relative to another place, you are picking up the repayment characteristics of that place. And one question you then have is it the income channel that is driving that pattern? And it is quite difficult to separate those two. Effectively, the way you separate it is that some places kind of differ a little bit in different ways.
Permanent income, not actual.
Well, the income patterns I show you are highly correlated. The pattern with permanent income there versus the income patterns that I'm showing you here, you can think of those as permanent income patterns, right? Are you not willing to think of, is that helpful to focus back on? I think the income patterns are really persistent, and that's something that we've shown in the earlier work. But to generate the separate prediction, the statement that it's not all operating directly through income, like just this mechanical income effect, is really identified off of some fun places. So think of North Texas has lower credit scores relative to income. It turns out, looks like it's kind of driven by people getting into trouble with auto loans and things of that variety. You move to North Texas, you're more likely to get on auto loans, you're more likely to pick up that type of behavior, and it looks like you're sort of capturing these kind of differences in behavior in proportion to exposure time. But the underlying model that I have in mind that rationalizes all of this is one that is, is telling us a little bit more about the earlier work, about what was it about the place and the general human capital. And I think it really is this kind of, or at least consistent with this idea that whatever is creating dependable workers is also perhaps creating dependable borrowers, and that's a natural, alignment in what place might actually be doing. I think, I don't like that phrase too heavily because it's quite normative to say it that way, but I think you can explain a lot of the data with that pattern.
So this is really interesting. I would just say as an asterisk that you might think about comparing your paper with the previous paper, because in effect the previous paper might have wanted to take all these data and throw them into some model and predict.
Sure.
And you're working with the variables you happen to have, and so you kind of look under the light post, pick those variables. You didn't, for example, pick education as a variable. But that aside, my real question is the delinquency rate. So I borrowed money from the car dealer, and I'm behind, but I have a college education and I can talk fast, and I go to the car dealer and I say, hey, Mr. Car Dealer, give me a break. Come on. He says, okay, Paul, you have another 3 weeks. I don't show up as delinquent. Some person who's poor, who's the wrong color, doesn't talk as fast, doesn't do that. And so is there any bias built into what gets recorded as a delinquency, and whether that bias is part of, shows up in the data and is correlated with your outcomes?
I like that. So two things. Certainly that story could totally make sense. I don't think that's what's driving it. So actually the majority of the 70% delinquency that I was showing you by age 30 is actually on things like phone bills and collection items. And you might think, okay, well, those things could be targeted to different neighborhoods or like different sales strategies that go in. They all persist, even conditional on very high dimensional location fixed effects. So totally on board that there could be some of those differences, and I don't want to say that's not going on, but I don't think that's the broad pattern of what we're seeing. I think it really is the same kind of opportunity set is leading to differences in repayment outcomes.
Yeah. 2 minutes left.
Yeah, I had a quick question about basically the results showing the disparities in delinquency conditional on credit score. And I was curious if you'd done what was the choice to use 90-day delinquency as the outcome that a credit score is?
It's the estimand of the.
I see, and that's publicly disclosed. Yeah. That's super interesting because I was thinking of it as that's the starting point of basically Sendel and Ziad have this healthcare algorithm paper where they show large disparities on health. But then if you flip and predict costs, I was curious about.
Yeah. No, you can also put other trade lines in that thing. So basically, the gaps by race that you observed persist across all trade lines. Yeah.
Any more questions? I'll take one, although we can follow up with this afterwards, which is the government
puts a lot of effort into subsidizing mortgages and providing credit guarantees, literally. But if you're subprime enough, you're not going to get access to those programs. Do you have a sense or how much the support for mortgages changes credit access on that dimension versus access to car loans or credit cards?
It's hard for us to kind of observe whether or not you got kind of one of those government-backed mortgages and the data that we have, so we haven't gone down that. But we do see it on student loans. So the student loan incidence follows kind of exactly this pattern with large differences. So black women in particular, we've got an appendix figure that just shows kind of the massive accumulation of student loan debt.
Government guarantees student.
And it's all government. It's all on the government balance sheet, and it's basically what we've been talking about with student debt forgiveness.
Okay, thank you very much.